Chapter 68, Wisely and Slow. Wisely and Slow.
Oral's breath, it's cold. How much further is it to Imn's Vale?
Frithla looked about them. The forest trail they were walking was familiar enough from the 2 previous times they had travelled it to and from the temple ruins, though it would be a good few miles to reach the village yet.
About another 3 hours.
Frithla heard a deep sigh and only just suppressed one herself. Since their fugitive, Valigar, had been revealed as the innocent party, he was, and all her hopes of any quick resolution to her troubles had been dashed in one fell blow. Frithla was finding it difficult to drag her heart from the disappointment it seemed to have been plunged. And with finding a fresh campsite and a group of tracks that looked unfortunately like they belonged to another mercenary band only yesterday, she wondered if she should even make the effort and bother trying. Frithla glanced to the pair just ahead of her, a Noman walking abreast with Jahara in silence. She let her eyes wander his back, his short hair forming a neat line across the nape of his neck, a good inch of tan skin showing above his cloak, and she wondered how he could bear to be without a scarf on so cold a day. Frithla dropped her face to bury it in the collar of her own cloak, forestalling any memories of her scarf before they could surface and returning her attention to one of her more immediate troubles.
"So, what do you think then?"
she asked quietly.
"Well, he's barely even looked at you these past couple of days. That we know of." "Yes, that we know of. Perhaps he's realized that you're just not that good a catch." "Oh thanks."
Frithla laughed, half amused, half stung.
"You know what I mean. It's not like you were particularly nice in your refusal." "Well, no, but he caught me by surprise and it was really awkward." "And how do you think he felt?" "What do you mean?" "Frithla, you marched off shouting no, no, no." "I did not shout," she corrected, the feelings of guilt she had been trying to ignore since the incident only growing stronger as she was reminded of their meeting, the last 2 days giving her plenty of time to think of 1,000 ways she could have handled it better. "And, of course, it sounds bad when you put it like that." "Well, how would you put it then?"
Frithla pushed her face even further into her collar, her breath condensing on the wool to leave it damp and slightly itchy.
"I meant it for the best," she mumbled, her voice small. "I know you did, dear. I mean, we found those tracks only a day ago, the time for making ties here in has long passed. Does the knowledge of this upset you?"
Frithla sighed and finally straightened, the rush of cold fresh air against the lower half of her face almost pleasant had it not held such a bite.
"No, no more than it should. So, do you think he hates me now then?" "Well, not hates you, but he probably just finds it hard to be around you. I'm sure it will get better with time. Maybe we can set him up with Ari."
Frithla rolled her eyes, fighting against a smile.
"No, no and no again, we are not doing that." "Oh, jealous." "Of course not, but I couldn't bear another relationship, with all the fights and the sulking. Ari and Herr Dallas were bad enough." "Oh, Herr Dallas. I do miss him." "Me too. Frithla, what are you muttering about?"
Frithla glanced to up, see Noman and Jahara had halted, the druid staring at her accusingly, her frown not quite masking the wariness to her eyes.
"Oh, just reciting a few of my old Loros lessons, you know, getting a bit of practice in for the translation of that diary. Yemenagris, I necromance, Yemenagrit, you necromance, Yemenagritus, he, she, it necromances."
Fritha beamed, wishing the pair of them would just turn around and carry on walking. The woman's gaze remained fixed on her a moment longer though before she relented, returning to their path with only a slight shake of her head to betray her unease. Anoman was still looking in her direction, but a glance risked to his face showed he was focused a good few inches above her head, and Fritha felt a sudden pang. When had he become the only one she could talk to? Of course, she could talk to anyone she pleased. But everything had felt somehow false since they had left Athkatla, all the words from her skin, dull and pleasant, and what she was supposed to say, rather than what she truly felt, the civil discourse of strangers. Jahara was clearly still writhing with the guilt of her perceived betrayal, something Fritha could not quite seem to sincerely assuage her of, while the Harpers still stalked her every step, while Ari had been quietly introspective since their talk 2 days before, something Fritha felt even less inclined to interrupt. And as for Minsk, Fritha adored the man as much as she had anyone, but there was only so long she could bear to have him trying to cheer her before she felt obliged to pretend it had worked, and that was worse than talking to either of the women. Fritha glanced to the group ahead of her, Minsk and their newest companion, Valigar, at their head, the pair well equipped to lead the way. No, it had been Anoman who had been the one she had turned to for a few days now, the man seemingly stern enough to trust with her darker thoughts without any worry that he would take them to heart. She knew now though that assumption might have been a touch hasty. Fritha sighed to herself. Of all the times such a revelation could have been brought to her, then was surely the worst. Then, when Harpers hunted her outside the city and a whole guild of vampires awaited her within it, and she was clinging desperately to the thought that she was only 10,000 gold away from escaping it all. And so that left her there, in her customary position at the back of the group and sharing her troubles and fears and general chit-chat with the only person she had yet to estrange, herself. Not that such a thing bothered her, apart from as the symptom of what it was, the desperate chattering of a burdened heart. She rubbed her chest as though to ease the weight of it, though she could barely even feel it through her mail. Oh well, only 3 more hours to go. Fritha was more careful for those last few miles though, not wishing to give Jahara any more cause to worry, and ironically she occupied herself going over what she could recall of her Loros, running through the long lists of vocabulary she had learnt by rote, conjugation rules and their obligatory exemptions, and anything she could bring to mind. Anoman glanced behind him. Fritha was still talking to herself and now appeared to be counting on her fingers into the bargain, the girl reaching her fourth before she paused, squinting as though she was trying to see something far in the distance. He turned back to their path, not wanting Jahara to notice as well, the trees before them at last thinning into the sodden plains of Imn's Vale. He had been the same for the last few days, forever trying to steal glances at the girl, almost as though to reassure himself that she was still there, Fritha's usual position trudging after them at the back of their group, making it harder to be inconspicuous about the thing. Not that she ever noticed, always with her head dipped and focused on the path before her as she muttered to herself, the occasional laugh drifting ahead to him on the cold air. Jahara had told him not to worry at first, that the girl was just disappointed over Valigar and prone to such when she was upset. But even Jahara had seemed anxious that day. Anoman wished he could just talk to Fritha, but he was not sure what to say, and he was finding it difficult to be around her now, his feelings still raw from her so wholehearted refusal of his affections. Not that he had given up, but he had told he would prove his regard with actions, and so far he could think of nothing. Considering the lives they were forced to live, he would have thought it would have been easy, but the dangers they faced almost every day now had made even saving someone's life habitual, and he remained at a loss. The small collection of roofs that made up Imnsvale were slowly creeping into view as they moved across the plain, the sky above them streaked amber and grey as the dusk fell. At least Fritha seemed more cheered as they finally arrived at the village, her new best friend rushing from her garden as soon as she saw them.
Fritha, you're back. Caught Je.
sang Fritha, scooping the girl up to dance with her, humming a tune he recognized as the Death's Waltz, and Anoman felt suddenly cold.
Fa la 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 la.
Kaj was laughing brightly, seemingly quite comfortable perched on Fritha's hip.
So, did you find the man you were looking for?
Fritha nodded, once sweeping her free arm towards the dark-skinned ranger.
Why, yes indeed, though instead of killing him we decided to let him join our company. Kaj, meet Valigar.
The girl dipped her head and bobbed in the semblance of a curtsy. Valigar nodded curtly, frowning down at the pair and looking more than a little perturbed by them both.
Oh, he looks scary,
Kaj whispered audibly. Fritha nodded.
I know.
Ka, came a voice, and they turned to see her blonde-haired brother. Valsben stood in the doorway of the house next to them.
Oh, good evening.
He greeted rather formally.
Vincent mentioned you had returned to the area. I hope your travels go well. Very well, thank you,
answered Fritha just as politely, Kaj snickering into her shoulder.
And congratulations upon your engagement.
The lad flushed slightly, grinning in a way that seemed much more natural than his previous civility, nodding his thanks and excusing himself as he turned back into the house, adding almost as an afterthought,
Kaj, Ma says dinner's ready. All right. Honey lamb.
The lad paused in the doorway but did not glance back to confirm the quiet cackling of the two girls. Fritha gently set Kaj back on her feet.
Can we still meet later, Fritha? Course. Just come down to the inn when you're finished. Kaj,
called a matronly voice from somewhere inside the house.
Coming, Ma. Goodbye Valigar, goodbye everyone.
The common room of the inn was warm and very welcome after so long out in the wilds, everyone disappearing to their rooms to quickly wash, and it was not half an hour later they were all back in the tavern, gathered about a table and sharing a meal together. Fritha was sat across from him, looking much happier for this chance to wash and change her clothes. The girl, bright and pretty in the lamplight, and Anoman found the sight as sustaining as the food in his dish. She had been wearing her hair down since the weather had turned, neatly tucked into the collar of her cloak, he assumed to keep the cold air from her neck. It was damp now from where she had rinsed it, and she had made an attempt to fasten it back as they ate, though it was already fighting back. He watched as she leaned forward slightly, a curl that hung much shorter than the rest escaping the ties to fall over her shoulder and just miss hers too. She frowned, hooking it behind her ear, and Anoman shared her annoyance. He had liked that curl. Would have even gone so far as to say it was his favorite in his weaker moments when he indulged in such foolishness. Always the first to escape the pins and hang over her shoulder in one long neat ringlet. Now it only just passed her collarbone, serving as a constant reminder of the one who had shortened it. Anoman turned away, thankfully distracted as Jahara took up her burden as the group's voice and turned politely to their newest companion.
So, how long were you actually in the hills here, Valigar?
The ranger slowly finished his mouthful to answer her.
About 10 days or more. I left the city on the very night the cowled wizards first attempted to capture me and summon the sphere. I thought myself quite well hidden and was prepared to spend the winter up there. It would have been hard, I do not doubt, but I have always preferred to spend my time in the wild, though it is good to eat something that is not rabbit meat bulked out with pearl barley.
He added, lips twitching with the first smile Anoman had seen him bear.
The cowled ones have much to answer for,
quipped Cerned, though Valigar merely nodded gravely at this mention of his arcane enemies.
Indeed, they do. They have wronged your company as well as mine, though I expect nothing else from their kind. I must admit, with what you have endured both recently and in the past concerning these mages,
I am surprised you would have one in your company.
Everyone seemed to turn instinctively to Ari, the girl looking quite caught out, a spoonful of soup halted halfway to her mouth.
Forgive me, Ari,
the ranger continued calmly.
I do not mean to attack you personally, but I have found that magic can corrupt even the best of intentions, twisting souls until they are unrecognizable. Believe me, for I know well of what I speak.
Minsk shook his head, looking uncharacteristically aggravated by his words, though he did not raise his voice any more than usual.
No, no, no. Who says this is not so with all wizards, and it is not so with our Ari? Some like Irenicus and those mages that stole away little Imoen, yes, they are corrupt and deserve your mistrust. But Rashomon is a land ruled by witches and it shines like a beacon in the eastern lands.
Valigar merely shrugged impassively.
I understand you find it difficult to accept my beliefs, but they are born only of my experience, and when others choose to ignore such, it becomes all the more important that I maintain this vigil against the corruption others would refuse to acknowledge.
Ari blinked slowly, looking about them all before venturing,
well, that is reasonable enough, I suppose.
A pause, Fritha glancing to the elf with an unreadable look, and Ari flushed, straightening slightly in her seat, her voice much surer and calm with a maturity Anomen had seen in her only recently.
Though I do not feel your vigilance will be needed in my case. I know of your troubles with Lavik, Valigar, and I don't think I could ever be like that. My magic is a gift I use to help people, and that's all.
A silence held the table, Valigar finally giving the briefest nod in acceptance of her opinion, and the tension over them passed, Fritha sending the elf a wink in the stillness that followed, Ari dropping her face to grin into her dish. And from there the talk moved on to the less contentious subject of their return to Athkatla, the group discussing their route and how they would enter the city without alerting the cowled wizards to their betrayal, and Fritha withdrew from the conversation completely, the girl giving her plate her undivided attention much to Jahara's frustration.
So, we are agreed that we should try to enter the sphere as soon as possible once in the city.
Valigar nodded once.
It would seem the wisest course. I have no idea how far the mages' powers stretch. They always had an uncanny way of finding me when I was still in the city. They may know the instant I set foot back within its walls. Then we should buy the supplies for the ritual here. And Lavik's notes will have to be translated before we reach Athkatla.
Came Ari. Jahara nodded, turning promptly to the girl at her side.
Will that be possible, Fritha? I said, will you be able to translate that diary before we reach the city?
Fritha continued to frown a moment before she seemed to piece together what she was being asked.
Oh, yes, well, the important bits anyway. I wouldn't have minded having a glance at a dictionary for some of the passages, but I'm sure I'll muddle through somehow.
The druid sighed.
Fritha, I do not think. Hey now, Kaj,
came a gruff voice from the bar behind them, Anomen glancing back to see the innkeep, Vincent, glaring sternly at the girl herself as Kaj peered shyly round the door.
You know you young UNS ain't supposed to be in here. It's okay, she's here for me,
said Fritha quickly, already on her feet and cloak in hand, her dinner presumably finished, and Kaj smiled.
Hello Fritha, I brought my skipping rope. Great. Well, I'll see you all later, then.
The pair were gone before any reply could be uttered. Jahara leaned back in her chair with a sigh, Valigar muttering something under his breath as he went back to his dish. Anomen's eyes were still fixed upon the door, the man turning back to the table only for Ari to catch his eye, the girl sending him a surprisingly impish smile, and in spite of everything Anomen felt himself returning it. After all, what else could they do? Frithha smiled, watching Kaj as the girl gazed through the small window next to them, the peeling shutters thrown wide to reveal a stunning view northwards over the twilit village and the dark forest beyond, though the girl's attention was focused much higher than that. Frithha had spent the last half hour showing her the few constellations which had just emerged, the young girl nodding gravely as she followed her hand, taking her lessons to heart. The sun had not yet set when they had left the inn, the pair of them going to visit Dalan in the north of the village to play at skipping and marbles before Blael called his younger brother inside for his dinner, and they had ended up there, in the old barn behind Minster Lloyd's house. Kaj had led her to it, telling her as they climbed the ladder to sit in the hayloft, that many people had camped in it on the night of the High Harvestide festival, though now it appeared to be used to store feed and hay for the winter. The girls sat in the eaves upon the fine mattress of hay.
"What's that one, Frithha?"
Frithha leaning forward to follow Kaj's hand to a bright star that had just emerged above the darkened treetops, two lesser stars hanging either side.
Oh, it's the lover's eye. Those three together make up Sun's bow."
Kaj nodded, eyes closing a moment as she made to remember this, and Frithha felt strangely sad. The girl was clever and, even more importantly, sensitive to the world around her. Indeed, Mirella seemed to have noticed as much while she had still lived. But unfortunately, the ranger had perhaps been alone in that, Kaj always in the shadow of her boisterous older brother who, through no fault of his own, had rather monopolized the attentions of his parents, first with his disobedience and now with his newly found maturity, and, as usual, Kaj remained unnoticed. Still, every cloud, Frithha considered as she leaned back against the wall behind her. The girl was afforded much more freedom for it, and she had a strong enough will that she would likely achieve whatever she wished either with or without any encouragement.
"What's that tune, Frithha? You were singing it before when we danced."
Kaj questioned, and Frithha realized she had been humming all that while.
Oh, it's the Death's Waltz. Death has a dance."
Frithha laughed.
"Well, so the composer thought. It is a sad tune for a sad story. Death may usually leave his dark realm only to collect the souls of living. But once a year, on the night of Feast of the Moon, he is allowed to leave the land of the dead to come to Faerun and join one of the street festivals that many of the cities hold, for one lone night of dance and revelry."
Kaj frowned slightly.
"Wouldn't he sort of stand out? He is a skeleton."
Frithha smiled.
"That's just what he wants us to think, so he can move amongst us unnoticed in his true form."
She leaned in, her voice little more than a whisper,
"A pale, gaunt youth with shaggy black hair and eyes that speak of darkness."
It was rather how Frithha imagined Renal Bloodscalp would have looked when he was younger, and Kaj was clearly impressed by this vision too, the girl nodding silently for her to continue.
"Now on one such night he meets and falls in love with a beautiful girl." "And what does she look like?"
asked Kaj promptly. Frithha shrugged.
I don't know. Blonde probably, they usually are. Anyway, they dance and revel all night, and he finally reveals to her his true nature. He is Death, Lord of the Dead, and he wants to take her back to his realm and make her his lady. But she is frightened and runs away. Through the twisting chaos of the Moon Carnival he makes a pursuit, hoping to explain and win her heart, but the sunrise comes before he can reach her. At the end of the song, Death must leave her in the world of the living as he returns alone to his own domain."
"Good," said Kaj firmly.
"Good."
Frithha laughed.
"Kaj, it's supposed to be tragic." "But why? If he's Death, won't taking her to the land of the dead?"
She dropped her voice, leaning in slightly as though they were talking of something they shouldn't.
"Well, it would be like killing her."
Frithha made a gesture somewhere between a nod and shrug.
"Well, yes, but he did not choose to be Death, Kaj, that's the tragedy. Well, I still can't see why he couldn't just get a girl who was already dead,
Kaj muttered practically, and Fritha laughed.
Well, maybe dead girls lack that spark of verve that death finds appealing in a partner. Ah, look, you can see the hunter already.
She sighed, pointing to a single bright star that had just crested the horizon.
It's getting late. Should we not be getting you back?
Kaj shook her head, plucking 3 long stalks from the hay beneath her and absently moving to plate them.
No, Mari's parents and sisters have come over to talk about the wedding, they won't notice I'm gone for ages yet.
She sighed deeply, tossing the twist of hay off into the darkness.
I'm never going to get married, I don't want a husband to boss me around. I'm going to grow up and be a ranger like Mirella was.
Fritha grinned.
Really? Because I think young Delon might have a mind to proposing in a couple of years.
She teased, taking up the girl's braid to playfully tickle her with the end.
Fritha!
Kaj cried, batting her away as she laughed, a comfortable silence falling over them, and somewhere in the forest behind the barn an owl called out, and Fritha imagined that all the tiny night creatures shared a shiver.
Fritha, do you think you'll ever get married? No, I don't think so.
The girl nodded sympathetically.
Yes, I see your problem. You're not like Mari, you can't just marry someone like Vals,
said Kaj, the disdain with which she spoke his name indicating that she did not consider her brother to be much of a catch.
You should marry a prince.
Fritha frowned slightly.
I don't think we'd have much in common.
Kaj nodded, gazing out the window as she gave the matter further consideration.
Maybe, she offered slowly, maybe you could marry Death, Fritha. You could meet him at a carnival like that girl did. You wouldn't be frightened, and the feast of the moon is not long away.
Fritha laughed.
Goodness, Kaj, what a morbid thought, though not one without merit,
she added with a calculating grin, her voice low and breathy as she continued.
I would see him, an island of calm darkness in the tempest of color and noise that is the Waterdeep Carnival, and together we would dance all night. And then, as the sun makes to rise, he would take me past the veil to his great gloaming hall, where his court flits and flutters in their decaying finery, and there we would hold rule, together forevermore.
Wow, breathed Kaj softly, that sounds. A clang somewhere outside the barn made them both start.
What was that?
Fritha swallowed, nervous herself. The Harpers surely would not try anything within Imn's Vale.
I'll go and see.
She shifted quietly to the edge of the loft and dropped silently into the darkness, landing easily enough in amongst the sacks of feed and drawing her sword as she crept towards the doors. She stopped as she reached them, her heart quickening as she strained to hear. Another rustle and something creaked ominously. It was just outside. Fritha glanced back to send Kaj a reassuring nod in the gloom before she turned, her hand slowly reaching for the handle when the door swung away from her and all 4 people screamed in chorus as Fritha was suddenly before 2 white-faced adolescents.
Valsben? And Mari!
She gasped, sheathing her sword clumsily in her shock.
Good grief! What in hells are you 2 sneaking about out here for?
We're sorry, my lady, stuttered Mari, her face even whiter now she had noticed her blade.
The barn, well, it's usually empty.
The couple suddenly looked rather sheepish. Val's been already going pink and Fritha really did not want to think any more about that.
Well, then just, be more careful in future, she finished sternly. Come on, Kaj, it's time we got you home.
The girl relented without too much protestation and they walked to her house, still talking of the stars and how Madolf had said he would begin to teach Kaj some of the forest crafts once the spring came around.
The girl's house was but a few paces away now, and their talk faded, Frithha gently lifting Kayach over her gate. According to the girl, it shrieked like a banshee, and Frithha watched as she carefully opened her door with a practiced hand, the sounds of laughter and talk instantly flooding out with the shaft of light. One last grin and Kayach had slipped inside, and Frithha was stood in the darkness once more. She smiled, turning to walk back down the hill. The village laid out before her, houses and the inn all gathered about the town square, the stone dais set towards the southern end, its broken pillars, spires of differing lengths silhouetted against the dark blue sky like some great stone crown. The light from the windows of the inn were casting a friendly glow over the building, and Frithha was rather looking forward to returning to her warm dry room and the bliss of sleeping in a proper bed after so long. The girl almost to the door when a voice called out from the darkness.
Frithha!
She was so startled she actually jumped. The girl, whirling to see the broad form of a gnomon, sat on the dais behind her, half hidden where he was leant back against one of the cracked stone pillars.
Gods, a gnomon!
She gasped, her heart still beating wildly as she approached him.
You've just taken 10 years off me.
He dipped his head briefly, the light from the inn casting the strong angles of his face into sharp relief.
Your pardon, I did not mean to startle you. Will you sit with me a while?
Frithha frowned, instantly feeling her reluctance. Though she sighed and let it go, it was not as though she could avoid him forever. She sank down onto the cold stone next to him, and it was only then she noticed the bottle in his hand. He saw her looking and passed it to her without a word, the girl taking it, turning back to gaze at the warm light of the inn as she took a quick draught, the spirits burning her throat.
I remember you and Nalya dancing out here in the rain,
he continued absently as she passed the bottle back to him,
and then again at the High Harvestide Festival. I almost asked you to dance, but the boy, Valsben, cut in and then I had no opportunity. Your face was grazed. I remember thinking that, even so, you still looked very pretty for it.
Frithha sighed, feeling suddenly sad and rather wishing she could have another mouthful of whatever he was drinking. But he did not offer again, and she did not ask. It was colder out there in the unsheltered square, and her fingers beginning to hurt. She had left her gloves in her room in her haste to leave with Kayach. She distractedly moved a hand up to breathe on them, the chink of glass on stone catching her attention as a gnomon set the bottle down to turn to her.
Here, let me.
He moved to take her hand, but she pulled back from the contact, flushing with an embarrassment which quickly turned to guilt as she saw the hurt on his face.
No, they're fine, thanks.
He nodded, returning to his bottle, and Frithha swallowed tightly, wishing she could take it back, somehow take it all back. Everything was different now. Before she wouldn't have given it a second thought. Her hands were cold, his hands were not. It would just have been a gnomon being nice. But something had changed between them the instant he had given her that flower, and now everything felt foreign to her, all awkward and confusing.
My lady, I feel we must talk.
The immortal words were spoken, and the warmth of her blush seemed but a distant memory in view of the ice that now hung heavy and dull in her stomach. Frithha drew a deep breath, steeling herself before nodding once.
I would talk about the previous day, when I spoke of my feelings for you. I understand that it came as a surprise, something that I feel was not helped by the way my declaration was born.
A gnomon turned to her, his look earnest.
I understand you may find me a poor suitor, Frithha, but however inarticulate the expression, the feelings behind it are most sincere.
Frithha sighed deeply, that was rather the problem.
A gnomon, your poetic ability, or lack thereof, has nothing to do with it. And I would consider the fact you think it would as an indicator of our unsuitability. Well, then what is it about me that you find so objectionable? If you do not tell me which qualities are unsuitable, how am I supposed to change? Change?
she repeated rather more shrilly than she had intended in her haste to reply.
Anomen, that's the last thing in the world I would want. You don't need to change, you are fine as you are.
He stared down at her, searching her face for the truth of it before he sighed, turning away as he tipped the bottle skyward for another mouthful.
It is Aaron, is it not? Anomen, I've only met the man 3 times in my life. This isn't about him. This is about you and I. I just don't think that our relationship is one that would be enhanced by moving in this direction. I always saw you as a sort of...
Frithia trailed off uncertainly. The obvious choice here would have been brother, but that wasn't strictly true, not unless as a child she had been hoping for a brother who would have likely spent his time bossing her about and telling tales on her to Father Wellen. Minsk was definitely the more brotherly.
My lady. Georg. This is exactly what I mean.
She cried, we are not meant to be. You are clearly meant for someone who thinks being called my lady is positively charming, and I am meant to be with someone who can remember my name.
I can remember your name, Frithia, it has been haunting me ever since we met.
Frithia snorted.
What rot! You couldn't stand me for the first fortnight.
Anomen mouthed a moment, seemingly caught out by the truth of it before he drew himself up, looking stern.
You are correct. You were infuriating and willful and foolhardy. But then...
He paused, his voice quietening with a sigh.
But then I found I rather liked being infuriated by you, and worrying for you when danced off on some fool's errand, and I like you so completely, Frithia.
Frithia felt her heart groan.
Oh, Anomen. All this time, I know I did not speak of it, but I tried in every way to show you without words my regard.
He shook his head, suddenly frustrated.
I just cannot understand how you did not notice. And why in the hells would I?
Frithia burst out indignantly.
We spend half of all our time together arguing, and you said on more than one occasion I reminded you of your sister. But those evenings we went out about the city together. Evenings which Simon invited me to. What was I supposed to think?
Anomen drew back, blanched.
You favor Simon? Of course I bloody don't.
She snapped.
I wouldn't be cruel enough to curse so bright a youth with my affections. Curse.
He repeated, and Frithia suddenly realized how such must have sounded, the man staring down at her, his eyes full of a dewy compassion.
This has nothing to do with me being a ballspawn.
She interjected quickly.
Do not use that word. Why? You never cared before. I care now.
He snapped, the pair glaring defiantly at each other a moment before he sighed and shook his head, and Frithia turned away as he continued.
And if not the fact you are one of the children, then why else would you consider your regard as something unwelcome? That you have incurred the wrath of the Harpers or the displeasure of the Vampire Guild? Whatever objection you could have, I do not care. Anomen. No,
he cut in firmly,
you do not understand. I would do anything for you, Frithia. I was even prepared to stand by you had we allied with the vampires, even though it would have likely meant my expulsion from the order. Good gods!
She breathed, drawing back from the man in her astonishment, the conviction in his eyes unsettling her more than anything he had said so far.
You would have as well, wouldn't you? Well, then all the better a reason for us not to be together if that is the kind of madness it inspires. That you would even consider giving up the thing you spent your whole life working towards for some silly infatuation. Gods!
Anomen looked almost wild.
Infatuation? Frithia, I am in love with you. The feeling, it burns within me until you are all there is, and all I want is to feel you in my arms, to caress your skin and lay with you in the night.
Frithha stared back at him, her face so hot she was sure it was glowing, and not bothering to try and hide her dismay.
Why are you telling me this?
She cried shrilly. I told you I didn't share these feelings you have. I mean, I was worried.
That whole convincing me through actions speech had me thinking you had something really amazing up your sleeve. Something irresistible. I certainly wouldn't have been concerned if I had known you were just going to up and tell me you wanted to sleep with me. Frithha, I did not mean it like that. I don't care how you meant it.
She stopped herself with some difficulty, drawing a deep breath and giving herself a moment to calm down, well aware of how awful she had felt when she let her discomfort run away with her the last time.
I am sure your regard is sincere and true in all its aspects, Anomen, but I fear it changes nothing. I am going inside now. Don't stay out here too long, it is colder than those spirits will let you believe. Good night.
Jahara sighed inwardly, feeling more tired than she would have the man next to her realize as she and Valigar made their way along the first-floor corridor. The evening had seemed a long one, Frithha and then Anomen leaving with little explanation of where they were going, though the others at least had sense enough to stay at the table with their guest and project some semblance of professionalism, as they had spoken more of their plans and the deeds of their company so far. Valigar had even heard of some of their works about the city, though he had not realized they were the same group. He had offered little of his own tales, but seemed content enough hearing of theirs, and if he was not what Jahara would have considered one of the group by the end of the evening, he certainly seemed more at ease in their company, and that was at least something. After all, they had been his hunters but days before, and men who trusted too readily often did not do so for long. But however the evening had dragged, the hour had finally come when it was respectable enough to retire, Jahara rising to bid the table good night, and it had been clear then she had not been the only one waiting for this moment, Valigar standing an instant later to join her, and she doubted the others would be far behind them. Jahara nodded her thanks as Valigar opened the door and stepped back to let her pass, the stairwell to the second floor and their own rooms stretching up before her in the lamplight. So, the ranger began as they started their ascent, his voice holding the measured tone of a question long in the planning.
Does your leader often ignore discussions of what some would consider strategic importance and go out to play with the local children?
Jahara frowned, knowing how the girl's behavior must have looked to those not long in her company.
Frithha is not quite herself at the moment. I see in the night shunning all company in favor of the bottle.
The druid sighed.
Anomen is even less himself.
Valigar nodded, and she thought she could detect a glimmer of a smile behind the stoicism as he turned to her. The pair paused on the landing.
You need not explain further, it is clear enough that he and your leader have an unresolved regard between them, one that she has spurned if I read the situation correctly. She is wise to avoid such unnecessary entanglements. If her blood does not cause problems, this life surely will.
Jahara watched as a shadow of some past pain flickered behind his eyes, though he said no more. Not that Jahara would have presented a case against his words anyway, that life had already robbed her of many cherished companions, though, for all that, she would have chosen no other path. Valigar glanced back to her, nodding politely.
Well, good night, Jahara. Good night.
She waited until he had disappeared into his room before she turned to continue on to her own, the slam of the door at the foot of the stairwell behind halting her, and Jahara turned back to see Frithha tripping lightly up the steps, her ascent more hasty than carefree.
Frithha,
she greeted, the girl starting slightly at her address.
How was your evening? It was nice,
Frithha finally managed as she reached her, the girl halted on the step below, her cheeks glowing in the lamplight.
I thought I should get back though, make a start on that diary. Are you well? You are very pink. It's very cold out.
Jahara raised an eyebrow.
Indeed. I noticed a no-man was outside when I stepped out briefly to make my prayers, and so did you, I see.
She confirmed as Fritha flushed even pinker, turning her face away.
He seems very set on what he feels. Can you believe, amongst other things, he told me he wished to lie with me. He did.
Jahara exclaimed. Not that she had ever doubted it, but she was surprised the knight had managed to put aside both the indoctrinations of his upbringing and chivalry to voice as much. He was more impassioned that she had given him credit for.
And what did you say? No, of course. Fritha, calm down. I can't,
she cried, twisting her sleeves in her distress.
He just makes me feel so uncomfortable.
Jahara offered after a moment. Fritha swallowed and dipped her face.
Lonely. But, yes, also really uncomfortable.
She added matter-of-factly, sending the druid a half-smile.
I'm going to bed. Sleep well, Jahara. Yes. Yes, you too.
She murmured, the ache in her heart suddenly making it hard to draw breath. They had, of course, spoken since they had left Athkatla. Indeed, Fritha had presented her the olive branch before they had even left its walls, but Jahara still felt unable to talk to the girl as she had once done. How could she stand there offering her advice on how to deal with her current troubles when the greater number of them were her fault? She sensed someone on the stairs behind her and turned to see Cerned, the man just gazing at the girl's door as she had been.
They say that parents never stop worrying.
Jahara snorted, shaking her head dully.
She is not my daughter. I would that she was, then perhaps she would at least pay attention to what I tell her from time to time. I think she pays more heed to your counsel than you realize. She hears what I tell her and does the opposite,
the woman exclaimed with a bark of dry laughter, though at least she felt a touch better for it. Guilty or not, she would not let the girl bear this alone any longer, and though Jahara had no idea yet as to how she could even begin to help, the knowledge that she would try was of some comfort to her. Jahara sighed, sending the man a smile.
This will not be resolved tonight in the hallway. Good night, Cerned.
He bid her the same and Jahara finally retreated to her room and the rest that felt long overdue. End of chapter.